evening, everyone, and welcome. Bonsoir et bienvenue. My name is Alex Gates, and I am the Executive Director and Curator of the Canadian Automotive Museum in Oshawa, Ontario. On behalf of everyone at the museum, I'm glad you're able to join us on this beautiful May evening as we share Canada's automotive heritage. Today, we have more than 75 participants registered from across Canada, with a significant number of participants joining us from the Maritime Provinces, so welcome. I'm glad to see many returning viewers, as well as many new names on our registration list this evening. To begin with, let me cover a few technical details. We are using the Zoom webinar platform. So as a participant, you are able to see us and the presentation, but all of your cameras and sound are off. So you can sit back and relax this evening and enjoy our talk. Dumeric Depensier, our exhibitions and special projects coordinator, will be monitoring the Q&A this evening, and we will cover as many questions as possible following the presentation. If there's something we aren't able to get to, we can certainly follow up with you after the talk with the email address that you used to register. So feel free to add as many questions as you want in the Q&A, and we'll make sure to get to the bottom as many as possible. We are recording this talk tonight, and it will be uploaded onto our Canadian Automotive Museum YouTube channel next week. And there's going to be a link available on our social medias and in our June newsletter. So if you weren't, obviously, if you're watching right now, you're able to watch. But if you know people who are interested in this talk, you can certainly send that link out later to your friends. Following this talk, you're going to receive a brief survey on this event. And of course, as always, your feedback is always appreciated. Now, our third Thursday Zoom series is going to take a break for the summer. We find that in June, July, and August, the weather is a little too nice to want to be hanging out here in Canada, watching your computer or your TV screen. So go out, enjoy that summer weather, enjoy that patio season, but return on September 21st, because I promised you're going to have the most dashing and humble speaker to date. Yes, we're talking about me. I'll be speaking on the 60th anniversary of the Canadian Automotive Museum. My presentation will be on 60 years of collecting Canadian cars. If you enjoy this talk, our October 19th talk will be specifically on Volvo in Nova Scotia. We're going to have Andrew Phillips joining us from the Museum of Industry. So go ahead, enjoy your summer, but then be back here in September, October, November, and December, because we have a great lineup still to come in 2023. Finally, thank you to our national media sponsor, the History Channel. You just saw those commercials from them. They're our national media sponsor, helping to promote our 2023 events to a national audience, which is really great. Thank you also to Hagerty, who is our title series sponsor for the third Thursday talks, and of course to everyone who made a donation to the museum as part of your registration. As a charity, your support is vital to providing educational programs to Canadians. So Dumeric's going to drop a link in the bottom. I can do that thing like down there. There's a link in the chat if you'd like to make a donation in support of our programs, or if you'd like to become a member of the museum, because being a museum member is a cool thing to do. It's International Museum Day if you need a little bit more encouragement. So go ahead and join a museum, preferably our museum. We'd love to have you as a member. This evening, we are joined by Bill Jarvis, who is joining us all the way from Moncton, New Brunswick. He's been interested in cars ever since he was a young child and has been active in the antique auto hobby since 1970. He is the proud owner of a 1947 Studebaker Champion sedan. You might see him driving around New Brunswick or elsewhere in that. Bill is the Provincial Treasurer of the New Brunswick Antique Auto Club and is regional manager for the Atlantic Provinces and Québec Drivers Club. After a varied career in business, he is retired. Congratulations. I hope to reach that someday as well. He and his wife, Karen, enjoy traveling by car and have been on many exciting road trips in both Canada and abroad. So he's an expert in Studebakers, the Maritimes, and cars, three things we love at the museum. So thank you so much, Bill, for joining us. And we're excited to turn it over and hear about the cool cars of the Maritimes that you've been researching.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm glad to be here. Welcome, everyone. The first car that was constructed in the Maritimes was the Victorian, built by John MacArthur of Hopewell, Nova Scotia in 1899 or 1900. There were several cars in the Maritimes before then, but they were imported. The Victorian's frame is 1-inch pipe with a wooden body similar to a carriage. It has a 2-cylinder horizontally opposed engine. There's a cone clutch driving jack shafts. And originally, the final drive was by belts, and these were replaced by chain and sprockets, and Mr. MacArthur made the chains. It has 1 forward speed, no reverse, top speed of 4 to 5 miles per hour. And there was not enough power to climb even the slightest grade, so the car really was not successful because it was built in hilly territory. Only the one was built, and it's presently on display at the Nova Scotian Museum of Industry in Stellarton, about 10 kilometers from where it was built. Next one coming along, in 1868, a group of businessmen in Kentville, Nova Scotia formed the Nova Scotia Carriage Company. It became a successful manufacturer of carriages, sleighs, and slovens. In 1908, Jack and Daniel McKay, 2 brothers from Prince Edward Island, moved to Kentville and took over operation. They planned to build both horse-drawn vehicles and automobiles. They had the capital needed to operate, but needed expertise in building cars. That came when they hired Archie Pelton of Berwick, Nova Scotia. He and a Mr. Porter from Kentville had imported 2 cars in 1904, curved dash Oldsmobiles, and Archie Pelton took one of them apart and then reassembled it to learn automobile construction. About 1910, the McKay brothers got serious about building cars. They decided to use the Penn automobile as the basis for their car. Mr. Pelton went to Detroit and consulted with the president of the American Association of Automobile Engineers on what components to use. Buda engines and Bendix rear axles were chosen, and enough parts were bought to build 25 cars. Still, horse-drawn vehicles predominated. By 1911, the McKays were actively seeking car dealerships. Dan McKay and Archie Pelton drove a 1911 McKay Roadster as far as Regina and Saskatoon. Although few, if any, dealerships were established, this car and at least 4 others were sold in Saskatoon. In 1912, a group of businessmen from Amherst convinced the McKay brothers to set up a factory in that town. Tax incentives and free land were provided in a great location in the town. A huge factory was built, a 4-story brick building, 100 by 20 meters, or 340 by 60 feet. Unfortunately, its location on LaPlanche Street was on the edge of the Tantramar Marshes. And even before completion, one corner started to sink. Engineers were brought in from New York to recommend repairs. The sagging corner was heavily reinforced with concrete, but this used a lot of the company's capital. During the winter of 1912 to 13, the machinery to produce cars was installed, and even as production of cars started, the building was still being repaired. 2 models were built. One was a 30 horsepower Roadster selling for $1,450 FOB Amherst. The other was a 5-passenger or 7-passenger touring car with a price of $2,050. And these were more expensive cars than most ordinary people could afford. The McKay brothers were looking forward to building 1,000 cars per year and having 1,500 employees. But then another disaster struck. The Penn Company went bankrupt. The money spent reinforcing the building left the company without enough capital to update its models. And with their source of engineering and many parts gone, the McKay factory closed. Based on the known serial number range, it is estimated that 180 to 200 McKays were built. One is the Roadster owned by the Canadian Automotive Museum, and its torpedo body replaces the original McKay body. The other is a 7-passenger touring car, which was found in pieces in the Gaspereau Valley of Nova Scotia. The body was restored by the Pictou County Antique Auto Club and mounted on a Hudson chassis. It is on display at the Nova Scotia Museum of Industry. The McKay factory stood until October 25th, 1964, when it was destroyed in a spectacular fire that burned for 3 days. Well, New Brunswick wasn't long getting in on the motor vehicle interest. The Maritime Singer 6 was the idea of John A. Pugsley, one of the first automobile dealers in St. John, New Brunswick in 1912. 2 one-story brick buildings totaling 36,000 square feet were erected on Rothsay Avenue on the eastern outskirts of the city. Initial plans were to build 2 pilot models, touring cars with a 130-inch wheelbase. They would have right-hand drive. Gray and Davis electric lights and starters would be used, and that's very advanced for 1912. Annual production of 500 cars was planned. Unfortunately, by the end of 1912, the Maritime Company was bankrupt with no cars built. An agreement was made with Palmer Singer Manufacturing Company of Long Island City, New York, to assemble their cars in St. John. They would be sold under the name Maritime Singer 6. These cars would have a 128-inch wheelbase and a 50-horsepower 6-cylinder engine. The selling price would be $3,000, a very expensive car for that time. The first St. John Automobile Show was held on March 29, 1913. A Maritime Singer 6 Roadster and a chassis were on display. 2 touring cars were sold at the show, with those cars being imported from Palmer Singer. Every new venture needs some unique promotion. For the Maritime Singer 6, it was making the very first trip by car in winter from St. John to Halifax. On the stroke of midnight, starting New Year's Day 1914, a large crowd watched Otte White, James Pullen Jr., and Harry Irvin pull away from St. John City Hall and roar down Prince William Street in the big touring car. Otte White was the pilot. Harry Irvin was both a reporter for the St. John Standard newspaper and secretary of the New Brunswick Automobile Club. If no big snowstorms were encountered, Otte said, they would be in Halifax in a remarkably short time. The trip started reasonably well. It took 13 hours to reach Moncton, a distance of 160 kilometers. They drove with the top of the car folded down in temperatures as low as -29 Celsius. This was at least a decade before car heaters started to appear, and they wore heavy fur coats with matching hats to combat the cold. Just south of Moncton at Fox Creek, they ran into deep crusted snow. They spent from late afternoon through an entire night, going about 3 kilometers. The 78 kilometers from Moncton to Amherst took 28 hours. And they had carried picks and shovels, axes, boards, and canvas in anticipation of just these problems. The entire trip of about 450 kilometers took 58 hours. Of that, 25 and a half hours were spent fighting snow, fixing flat tires, getting out of ditches, and eating meals. After the trip, the Standard described Otte White as badly used up. All 3 suffered frostbite. Today, that trip takes just over 4 hours. Jack Pugsley made a business trip hoping to sign up dealers for the Maritime Singer 6. In Ottawa, A.E. Ray & Company, a major downtown department store, displayed a McKay in their store. In a newspaper interview in Ottawa, Mr. Pugsley stated that the Maritime Singer factory was the largest in Canada, which produced only 6-cylinder cars. He said they were having great success in marketing the cars because they were so strongly constructed. And when a passenger train derailed on the western outskirts of Ottawa, with some of its cars landing in the Ottawa River, A.E. Ray and Company sent a McKay out to help bring passengers back to the city. And this was reported in the newspaper. Unfortunately for the Maritime Singer 6, the Palmer Singer Company went bankrupt in 1914. And with their source of parts and engineering gone, Maritime Singer 6 also closed. Estimates of the number of Maritime Singer 6s produced vary from 6 to 24. My own estimate is 7. New Brunswick motor vehicle registration records of the period show there were 5 registered, all in the St. John area. The A.E. Ray and Company advertisement implies that they had 2, and I've not heard of any others. No Maritime Singer 6s are known to exist now. A source that I consider to be very reliable says that about 1980, a Maritime Singer 6 was pulled out of a garage in St. John and crushed. The Maritime Singer 6 building still stands at 600 Rossay Avenue, St. John. It is now the head office of Base Engineering Incorporated. In October 1913, Gordon M. McGregor, Vice President and General Manager of Ford of Canada, authorized the establishment of that company's 10th branch in St. John, New Brunswick. Part of the Maritime Singer 6 factory on Rossay Avenue was leased for the assembly of Ford Model Ts. The St. John location made good sense for several reasons. St. John has an excellent ice-free year-round harbor. There is very good rail service on the Canadian Pacific from Ontario via the line through Montreal. Duties and cars shipped to Australia, New Zealand, and Britain from Canada were much lower than on cars in the United States. And New Brunswick and Nova Scotia both required right-hand drive cars, as did Australia, New Zealand, and Britain. And Prince Edward Island was now legalizing cars to some extent, so a new market was developing there. The Model Ts built in St. John were really not much different than any of the others built in Canada. Production in St. John ended near the end of 1916. One interesting side note is the story of the pickled Fords. And you see a picture of one of them here, which is owned by George Fletcher. The SS Matachua was a freighter and passenger ship which normally sailed between Montreal to Australia and New Zealand. In 1916, a voyage was diverted to St. John to pick up cargo for New Zealand. This partly consisted of crated Fords and rolls of newsprint. Then, between 3,000 and 4,000 containers of calcium carbide holding 100 to 200 pounds each were packed between them, wherever space could be found. With the ship loaded and ready to sail, about 2 a.m. on Sunday, March 12, 1916, a fire of unknown origin started in one hold of the ship. The fireboat and the St. John Fire Department were on the scene quickly, but had great difficulty extinguishing the fire over the next 16 hours. Calcium carbide must be packed in airtight, watertight containers. When water touches this chemical, it forms acetylene gas. Obviously, some of the containers leaked, causing gas to rise through the ship. And when it reached a small stove in the captain's cabin, it caused a major explosion and a second fire aboard the ship, and it killed Captain L.B. Gillum. The ship was deliberately scuttled, and at low tide, the stern was on the harbor bottom. Much of the cargo was salvaged. The Fords were returned to the St. John plant and repaired. And then instead of being exported, the cars were sold locally. And after spending at least a month in salt water, they became known as the pickled Fords. Well, it was a long time before we had more car manufacturing in the Maritime. Industrial Estates Limited was a Nova Scotia Crown corporation set up by the government of Robert Stanfield to attract industry to the province. And among its most successful clients was Volvo. Their first factory outside Sweden opened in a former sugar refinery at Eastern Passage on the Dartmouth side of Halifax Harbor. And this also was the first factory in North America since 1934 to be owned by a manufacturer from outside this continent. Why Halifax? Well, again, it's got a deep ice-free harbor and one of the best in the world, and it is the closest major harbor in North America for ships coming from Europe. Ocean-going ships could unload cargo directly onto the factory property, and CN Rail served the property, so it was easy to ship cars anywhere in North America. On June 11th, 1963, Prince Bertil of Sweden used a gold-plated screwdriver to install the final screw on the first Volvo ever assembled, the one you're looking at here. Excuse me, the first Volvo ever assembled outside Sweden. It is a black 1963 Volvo B18 four-door sedan with red interior, also known as the Model 120. In Canada, it is called the Canadian. Elsewhere, it is the Amazon. And in the first year, 3,600 cars were built. The first car was used by Edward Benson, the Nova Scotia Minister of Trade and Industry, as his official car. Then in 1967, it was donated to the Nova Scotian Museum of Industry, where it's now on display. And as you saw, it has Nova Scotia license number 00001. In 1991, it was restored by Volvo technicians and museum staff. Factory expansion came in 1967, when a purpose-built factory was built at Pier 9 on the Halifax side of the harbor. This enabled production to expand initially to more than 8,000 cars per year, and in 1974, it reached 12,000 cars. Once again, ships could unload directly onto the factory property. CN Rail served the factory, which is very close to a major rail yard. This factory primarily built the Volvo 140 and 240 series. When assembly of the Volvo 740 started in 1987, an even larger factory was required. A state-of-the-art factory was built in the Bayers Lake Industrial Park on the western outskirts of Halifax. Other Volvo models built in Canada included the 760, S70, and a small number of S80s. Volvo production in Canada totaled 238,800 cars in 36 years. The cars built in Canada mainly used parts imported from Sweden. There was some Canadian content, which at one time reached 30%. If the plant also could have exported cars to the United States, it would have been even more successful. However, under the Autopact agreement between Canada and the United States, North American content of 50% or more was required for duty-free import into the United States, and that was never achieved. Volvo Canada received a lot of publicity when Gary Sowerby of Halifax and Ken Langley of Cape Breton drove a Halifax-built 1980 Volvo 245 DL station wagon around the world. And that's the car on your screen there. This trip took 74 days, 1 hour and 11 minutes to set a new Guinness record for the fastest such trip by car. The old record was 102 days. And that record was never broken until after the rules were changed. They traveled in 23 countries on 4 continents, crossed both the equator and the Arctic Circle. And the story is online and very, very well worth reading. And this Volvo is now on display at the Maritime Motorsports Hall of Fame in Petitcodiac, New Brunswick. The Volvo factory in Halifax always appeared to be successful and profitable. In 1998, there were 225 employees. It was a big surprise to most people when on September 9th, 1998, Volvo announced that the Halifax would close due to the company's excess production capacity worldwide. The last car was built on December 18th, 1998. On January 28th, 1999, Ford Motor Company announced it was buying the worldwide automobile section of Volvo. This is just 4.5 months after the announcement of the closure and 6 weeks after the last car was produced in Halifax. Multi-billion-dollar business deals take more time than that. The following comment is purely speculation and only my personal opinion. I have no facts or proof to base this on. I think there probably is a connection between the Ford takeover and the closure of the Volvo factory in Halifax. Peter Monk and David Gilmore were two well-known businessmen in Halifax, in Nova Scotia. They owned Clairtone Sound Corporation in Stellarton, which at the time was a world leader in electronics. They formed Canadian Motor Industries in May 1964. They immediately obtained the rights to import Isuzu and Toyota cars into Canada, but their principal aim was to assemble and manufacture cars in Canada. With the assistance of Industrial Estates Limited, CMI established a 90,000 square foot assembly plant in 2 buildings at the former Point Edward Naval Base in North Sydney. On January 18th, 1967, the Cape Breton Post quoted a story from the previous week's Financial Post. Production by CMI of Isuzu Bellettes for the Quebec and Ontario markets would start in May, with 1,000 cars to be produced in 1967. Within 3 years, a new plant costing $4.5 million would be built, enabling Toyotas to be assembled there as well. And consideration was given to the possibility of exporting cars to the United States, South America, and Europe. The first Isuzu Bellette came off the assembly line on January 31st, 1968, after 2 years of planning. Plant manager John McCaffrey said that production of 10,000 cars per year was hoped for in the early 1970s. The general manager was Hiroshi Tobe. On April 25th, 1968, a ship brought the first direct shipment of 200 Japanese-built Toyotas to the plant for distribution in Eastern Canada. It also carried 240 Isuzus for assembly by CMI. And on August 1st, 1968, the Cape Breton Post showed a picture of several rail cars carrying the first Isuzus destined for Western Canada. The CMI plant had 35 employees who produced 1,300 cars in the 1967 and 68 model years. Bellettes had a good reputation for quality, but unfortunately they would not meet new Canadian bumper and emission standards taking effect in 1970, and production of Bellettes at CMI ended in 1969. Toyota, perhaps reluctantly, took over production at the CMI plant. Corollas were built there from 1969 to 1975. In 1971, 1,300 Corollas were built there out of 58,000 cars sold in Canada by Toyota that year. On May 25th, 1972, CMI announced that production of Toyotas would increase from 7 cars per day to 10, with the expansion requiring an investment of $180,000. In contrast, Toyota factories in Japan produced a car every 58 seconds. It was noted that parts coming from Japan took 4 to 5 weeks to arrive by ship. The factory's biggest production year was 1973 to 74, when about 1,900 cars were built. For every 3 cars built at Point Edward, Toyota could import 1 completed car from Japan duty-free. But with only 3% of the Toyota sold in Canada being built in Nova Scotia, that wasn't a huge benefit. And not all went well with the operation. Building a Corolla at CMI cost $200 more than importing the same car built in Japan. In 1973, CMI operated at a loss of $1,600,000. And in 1974, some Toyota dealers in the Atlantic Provinces refused to accept cars built at CMI, saying the quality was not as good as those built in Japan. Announcement of the factory's closing came in an article in the Globe and Mail on July 10th, 1975. There were several reasons. The principal one was a change in the exchange rate between Canadian and Japanese currency, which made production here even more expensive. Slightly over 9,000 cars were assembled at CMI. The Irving family, as many people know, owned many types of businesses. And for 8 years, this included truck manufacturing. A professional engineer, William McNeely, was hired in October 1970 as general manager and manager of operations. Previously, he had been a senior engineer at International Harvester and at Western Flyer Coach. And the purpose of the company was to build specialty heavy trucks with features and reliability superior to other makes. Also, other makers often couldn't supply trucks as quickly as customers wanted them. In May or June of 1971, the prototype truck that you see on the screen now was hand-built at Atlantic Truck and Trailer in St. John, and even its fiberglass hood and fenders were built on site. The prototype was registered as a universal, as the Scott name had not yet been chosen. And this is a conventional 3-axle, 10-wheel truck tractor. It's almost identical to the Scott model A1HD, and this prototype was in service with J.D. Irving Limited for 22 years. Then it was restored and was on display for several years at the Nova Scotia Museum of Industry. Once the Scott name was chosen, production started in a 45,000 square foot building at Debert Airport, Nova Scotia, and that had been built during World War II as a hangar for Lancaster bombers. The A1HD was most commonly used for highway truck tractors. 5 Cummins and Detroit diesel engines with matching Fuller transmissions and Hendrickson rear suspensions were available. The A1HD used a Ford Louisville cab shell, but all other components were manufactured at the Scott factory. The other model available from the start was the C1H, which is a cab-over engine 10-wheel truck. And these were commonly used for oil delivery, dump trucks, and similar. They had Ford 534 gasoline engines, but this was right at the end of using gasoline engines in heavy trucks. In 1975, the A1HD was replaced by the A2HD, which has a more square appearance, although the dimensions are very similar. And the one advantage of the A2HD was that the fenders tilted with the hood, making engine compartment service easier. Also in 1975, the C1H was replaced by the C2HD, now equipped with diesel engines. And really the only difference in appearance was the smaller grill opening on the A2HD. And these cabs were manufactured in Mahone Bay. Scott trucks had high quality construction and corrosion resistance was important. Driver comfort was an important selling point. The dashboard was well laid out and the extreme duty radio even included an 8-track player. They had 2 main criticisms. One is they were a bit heavier than competing trucks, but Scott salespeople said, well, it's a better truck, it's going to be on the road more, so it's going to be making you profit more often. and they were more expensive than some of the off-the-shelf trucks. But as sales manager Reed McVicker said, Scott's compared more than favorably in operating costs, maintenance costs, ease of service, and reliability. And Scott particularly excelled in building trucks for custom needs of customers. They built a couple of drill trucks that were taken 250 meters underground to work in a salt mine at Pugwash, Nova Scotia. 3 huge off-road dump trucks were built for Sydney Steel, and you see one of them on the right there. And look at the man in the picture, how small he is compared to the truck. And they built special trucks for snowplows for use in northern New Brunswick, where Oshkosh and FWD trucks had trouble handling the drifts. And oversized airport fuel trucks were built for Pearson Airport and others. Fire truck chassis, model C2FD, became an important part of the business. More than 30 Scott fire trucks were sold in the Vancouver area, and Toronto had at least 11 of them. Scott fire trucks were sold in 8 provinces, and they were everything from tankers up to snorkel trucks capable of lifting firefighters 85 feet. Scott built the cab and chassis, while companies such as King, Pierreville, and Thibault built the firefighting equipment. Fire trucks and airport crash trucks were exported to Iran, Iraq, Mexico, and Venezuela. And among these was a huge off-road crash truck. And you'll see the chassis being tested on the one picture on the screen now. Its engine air take and exhaust are high in the air, so it could travel through deep water if needed. Production of Scott trucks ended on May 29, 1980, 8 years and 2 days after it started. Changes to the duties on imported trucks made it easier to import. Canada was heading into recession, so demand for trucks was dropping, and interest rates were climbing toward the highest in our history. The last conventional Scott was the only A3HD, and it was a premium truck with air conditioning, power windows, power mirrors, integral sleeper, all very rare features at that time. In all, 1,155 Scotts were built. It's estimated that 40% were sold to Irving companies, 25% to governments, 25% for fire trucks, 10% to other customers. And a moment ago on the screen, there was a picture of a big blue Scott on the left. And that 1975 C2FD, equipped with a 75-foot King aerial snorkel, was in service with the Fredericton Fire Department in 2012, and it's now in regular service with Les Caldwell Steeplejacks of St. Stephen, New Brunswick, and the operator can reach up to 90 feet above the ground. And having talked to Mr. Caldwell, I can tell you he's very proud to have that truck in his fleet. When I communicated with Bill McNeely and Reed McVicker in 1995, it was clear that both were very proud of having worked for Scott. To quote Mr. McNeely, the creating and running the Scott operation was probably a career high for most of us involved. It would be most difficult and indeed very rare to duplicate the loyal teamwork and accomplishments of the Scott employees. And then we come to Bricklin. In 1972, Malcolm Bricklin hired a design team to come up with a sports car, a 4-cylinder car weighing about 1,000 kilograms. By the time the prototype was built in December of that year, the car weighed 1,700 kilograms and had an American Motors V8 engine. Bricklin first approached the Quebec government as a place to build it, and he offered them a 40% ownership for $7 million investment. The province looked into his background and quickly said no. Bricklin then came to Premier Richard Hatfield of New Brunswick, and Premier Hatfield liked Bricklin's wheeler-dealer style. Bricklin projected that 10,000 to 12,000 cars would be built in the first year. His budget showed an 18% return on investment over 20 years, and the province was asked for $6.5 million. Unfortunately, no due diligence was ever done on any of Bricklin's figures. Most importantly, no one looked into the engineering of the unique acrylic and fiberglass body material. No adhesive existed, which would reliably bond the two materials. They have very different expansion rates as temperatures change. And Albert Bricklin, Malcolm's father, said the way to test panels was to hit them with a 7-pound hammer. Wastage ran from 15 to 25%, sometimes higher. The gull wing doors were a problem. They weigh over 75 kilograms each, and two different lift systems were used, one an electric motor, the other hydraulic, and neither works well. With the electric system, one door must be opened fully before the other starts to open. American Motors 360 cubic inch V8s were used in the 1974 models, with both automatic and standard transmissions available. The 1975 and 76 models had Ford 351 Windsor engines with automatic transmissions. The financial position of the company was always a mess with no controls. The initial retail price of the car was $6,500, but the actual cost of building each car over the production life was about $13,000 for the whole production run. So at best, Canadian Bricklin lost at least $6,000 in every car. Nearly all new Bricklins were exported to the United States, and toward the end of production, Bricklin's American company, General Vehicle Corporation, stopped paying the Canadian company for the cars. An audit done for the province of New Brunswick by Clarkson Gordon Chartered Accountants in the summer of 1975 resulted in the immediate closure of the company. And when New Brunswick's Minister of Economic Development learned about the cars not being paid for, he threatened to arrest anyone who exported any more. A court ensured that Bricklin employees in New Brunswick received all pay and vacation pay that they had earned, but the province had to make an advance to cover that. Malcolm Bricklin's reaction to the closure was that if the province would advance only another $15 million and reduce controls, all would be well. That advance did not happen. The province lost about $23 million on Bricklin, and it's been estimated that dealers, suppliers, and car owners lost maybe another $10 million. And this is on production of 2,906 cars. At least 2 books were written in New Brunswick about Bricklin, and the one on your right, Bricklemanship, quotes statements made by Malcolm Bricklin and by politicians, then fact checks them. It's a really funny book if you're not a New Brunswick taxpayer. And Theatre New Brunswick audiences enjoyed a hilarious play where the characters were Malcolm Bricklin, Richard Hatfield, and ordinary Bricklin employees. So that's the story of motor vehicle manufacturing in the Maritimes. And there was one more, a travel trailer dealer, Signet, in Woodstock, New Brunswick, that built from 1970 to 76. And these trailers, lightweight, very popular with members of the New Brunswick Antique Auto Club and other antique owners. And some of these are still on the road today. The one pictured here is one that I owned for 25 years. So that's the end of the story on motor vehicle manufacturing in the past. We do have some 3 secondary manufacturers, that ambulance and fire truck builders, and that's the extent of our present motor vehicle industry in the Maritime Provinces.
Oh, well, thanks so much, Bill. Just as we get some questions filtering in from the crowd, I had a question going back to McKay's. I'd heard that they placed pretty well in some of the Nova Scotia's first road races. Do we know who they were racing against?
Well, there was supposed to be a race between a McKay and some competing car, and the competing car didn't show up, so two McKays raced. And I believe there's a picture there of a McKay with the big trophy on the hood that was the winner of that race.
Rhythm's asking for some of the earlier manufacturers that went bankrupt or suffered from bankruptcy, like Maritime Singer and McKay. Was there ever any government attempt to provide bailouts, or is this sort of too early for the era of bailing out car companies?
As far as I know, there was no government involvement in either one of them.
Yeah, certainly in our research on McKay's, because of course of our McKay in the collection, the general impression I got was that this was seen as a more of almost a municipal issue. It was on Amherst to support the factory, and if Amherst couldn't support the factory, then the attitude, back in 1910 was that it wasn't really the province's problem.
Yeah, well, I think the situation with both McKay and Maritime Singer 6 was that they lost their base and didn't have the capital to look for other manufacturers to supply parts. And the other thing, of course, is that automobile design was changing very rapidly in that era. So a company would have to be successful and have lots of capital in order to stay with the times. And of course, at the time, there were hundreds of manufacturers that pretty quickly got boiled down to a few dozen. And then now today, we're down to a handful of manufacturers. I think there are 5 manufacturers in Canada at present.
That sounds about right. Maybe speaking of technical changes, and I'm asking questions about McKay just because they're the maritime cars certainly we know the most about, other than Brooklyn's at the Automotive Museum. But can you do some myth busting or myth confirming? I've heard a story that I think the auto historian Glenn Beckler quotes about one of the flaws with the early McKays was that if you drove them for too long in hot weather, their oil gauges could burst and spray hot oil all over the driver's seat.
I've never heard that, but it's possible that could be true. I just don't know.
Okay. I've never, other than one apocryphal story in Beckler's writing, I've never found a confirmation or a denial that if you drove your McKay in the sun for too long, you'd get a nasty surprise. But
yeah, I think Jeff Lee is the expert on McKays, and he's the person to ask that sort of question too.
Yeah. Any other questions coming in? Alex, anything you'd like to field from your end?
Everyone's being shy tonight, which is unique for us. It must be all that fresh air this time of year.
Rhythm's asking another question. Given that Ontario was very much the hub for auto manufacturing in the early days of that sort of pre-World War I auto boom, was there any effort to do sort of inter-Canadian collaborations? We saw lots of, we saw companies sourcing, going to the United States for parts, but was there any attempt to go to Ford Canada, go to McLaughlin, go to Russell or Grey Dort or any of the other big Canadian manufacturers for them to set up maritime branches?
I'm not aware of any of that. And I think that at the time, pre-First World War and back historically, there was a lot of trade between the Maritime provinces and particularly the New England states. So going to the United States would not have been out of line at the time.
One thing we didn't bring up, could you this is less a question and more an interesting sort of bit of historical trivia that came up in our talks. Can you discuss the role of Richard Nixon in the maritime auto industry?
Well, sort of secondhand. Canadian Motor Industries had the opportunity in 1965 to buy the Canadian assets of Studebaker. Now, at that time, Studebaker had stopped building cars in the United States, but of course, we're still building cars for the North American market at their modern, profitable factory in Hamilton, Ontario. But they had the factory for sale for $2 million. And the idea was that CMI, Canadian Motor Industries, would buy Studebaker. Studebaker would build the regular cars in Hamilton, and they would build Isuzus and Toyotas under the Studebaker name in Sydney. And so the Studebaker of Canada representatives were in Japan as part of the negotiations. And Richard Nixon instructed them to go to Nissan as well and get a competing offer. And Toyota, of course, heard about this very rapidly and basically kicked the Studebaker people out the door. And Nissan, having not been approached first, were not interested either. So that killed any hope of that deal. And yes, it was that Richard Nixon.
Before he was president.
Well,
Yeah.
Well, you can't beat a Nixon story on a nice Thursday night.
Yep. We seem to have a dull moment there and a few minutes to go. So perhaps I'll mention the three secondary manufacturers that we have in the Maritimes.
Sure.
Valley Industries in Dieppe, New Brunswick, manufacture ambulances using Ram ProMaster and Ford Transit 350 trucks. And they supply all the ambulances used in New Brunswick, those being ProMasters. They also have customers across Canada and the United States, and they build patient transfer vehicles and many other specialty vehicles. TriStar Industries in in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, build type 1, 2, and 3 ambulances, and they also build fire truck rescue units. And they supply all of Nova Scotia's ambulances and also have customers across Canada and the United States. And then in the village of Centerville, New Brunswick, population around 800, there's a major fire truck builder, Metal Fab, and they build on several different chassis, Spartan, International, and so on. And they supply fire trucks of many different types. And again, their customers are across Canada, and also with some in the United States.
Excellent.
A comment from Clark, one of our regular attendees. Hi, Clark. Clark says he once owned a 1972 Volvo 145S station wagon in apple green, and he could always tell which components were locally sourced because they were the ones that broke down the most.
Yeah, Volvo's had a pretty good reputation, actually, and I know in my own case, twice I went to a Volvo dealer and couldn't in Halifax, and a good salesman could have sold me a car, gotten me away from Volkswagen, and in that dealership, I couldn't even get a test drive.
Well, thanks, Bill. Any last maritime stories? I know we're going to continue on our fall talk. We're going to continue. We have a October speaker on just Volvo, getting into that story specifically, and also Dimitri Anastakis is jumping in November on just the Auto Pact. I know these things all kind of crisscross in terms of the excitement of Canadian tariffs and 30% versus 50% and where you can sell your cars and so forth. So stay tuned for more presentations. And Studebaker obviously has come into this as well. So lots of great cross Canada connections. Yeah, any last anecdotes about Canadian or Nova Scotia maritime cars, New Brunswick cars? Maybe
No,
something about P.E.I. to kick it off?
Well, of course, P.E.I. had perhaps the first car in Canada, not built in Canada, but Father Georges Belcourt had his steam car, which was imported from the United States and towed by a team of horses from Charlottetown to Rustico. And he was a very interesting man. Actually, he set up a bank in Rustico, the Farmers Bank, which was very similar in setup to our credit unions today. And then, of course, that was a year before the first car was actually built in Canada in Stansted, Quebec.
One interesting fact about the Belcourt car that we turned up in our talk we did a couple of years ago with Rudy Crokin on that particular vehicle was that the funds for that car may have, through a very long and convoluted series of political connections, come from the coffers of Emperor Louis Napoleon III of France.
Really?
So the Emperor of France may have donated some money to the Jesuits, which in turn allowed Belcourt to afford a brand spanking new American steam car to show off at his St. John the Baptist Day celebrations.
And unfortunately, I understand that it wound up in a ditch fairly quickly.
Yes, absolutely. And we don't know much else historically after that, unfortunately.
No, a great story. So, well, thank you again, Bill. I have 8 o'clock on my clock, so we'll wrap up. And if anyone has any other questions, feel free to reach out to the museum, or you can see Bill's email address there. So thank you again, Bill. I hope we get to see you the next time you're passing through Ontario on one of your road trips. You can see what's new. Come check out our I guess, how many maritime cars do we have officially, Demeric? 2? I want more than that, but I think we have 2.
Yeah, because we've got our McKay and our Brooklyn, or I believe our maritime contingent.
Well, I've given you a few more to go searching for now.
We do,
Okay,
yes,
well,
more to look for out there. Anyway, we'll let you go for the evening. Thanks for joining us,
My
and
pleasure.
everyone have a great summer, and we'll see you back in September. Of course, the museum is open, and we'll be doing other programming, in-person programming for the most part over the summer. So we'll see you back when the weather gets cool again.